The 1960s were one of those eras when an automobile could stop you in the street before you even heard its engine. It was a decade in which American design changed at an incredible pace. The enormous fins and chrome excesses of the 1950s began to disappear, giving way to cleaner lines, lower roofs, fastback profiles, muscular bodies, and some of the most elegant shapes Detroit ever put on four wheels. And what makes it interesting is that there was no single definition of beauty. That is why today we are going to explore 10 of the most beautiful American automobiles of the 1960s. And we begin with one that turned the enormous silhouette of a full-size Chevrolet into one of the most recognizable images of the entire decade. 1965, Chevrolet Impala Sport Coupe. Some cars become beautiful because they are rare. The Impala did practically the opposite. It was everywhere and still managed to become an icon. Chevrolet completely redesigned its full-size lineup for that year, abandoning much of the straighter styling of the previous model and creating a much more fluid body. The change was immediate. The fenders took on that subtle Coke bottle shape. The waistline seemed to narrow in the middle, and the roof of the Sport Coupe sloped toward an almost fastback rear end, making an enormous full-size automobile look surprisingly low and dynamic. And perhaps that is the Impala's greatest achievement. It did not need enormous fins, extravagant ornaments, or futuristic solutions to attract attention. Viewed from the side, practically everything worked because of the proportions: a long hood, an enormous clean body side, thin pillars, and a roof that seemed to rest delicately on the body. The rear also retained one of the details that had already become an Impala signature: 3 round taillights on each side. It was an extremely simple solution, but seeing those 6 lights at night was enough to know exactly what automobile was ahead of you. The front followed the same philosophy. A wide grille occupied practically all the space between the 4 headlights, while the chrome bumper was integrated underneath without trying to compete with the rest of the design. Everything looked lower, wider, and considerably more modern than just 1 year earlier. But the 1965 Impala had another characteristic that explains part of its appeal. It could be almost anything its owner wanted. Chevrolet offered everything from modest 6-cylinder engines to large V8s, and anyone looking for a sportier image could step up to the Impala Supersport. But even a conventional sport coupe retained exactly what interests us here: that pillarless hardtop silhouette that, with the windows lowered, left practically the entire cabin visually open. And the public responded in a way that is difficult to imagine today. The conventional Impala series alone exceeded 800,000 units during the model year, and when the Impala Supersport was added, the total passed 1 million. It was one of the greatest commercial successes in Chevrolet history. Normally, when something is produced in such enormous numbers, it loses part of its aura over time. With this Chevrolet, the opposite happened. More than 6 decades later, the 1965 Impala Sport Coupe is still instantly recognizable. And perhaps that is precisely because Chevrolet achieved something much harder than building an extravagant automobile, making an enormous family car look elegant from practically every angle. 1961, Buick LeSabre Convertible. If the Impala already showed where American design was heading, this Buick belongs to a much more curious moment, when the 1950s still refused to disappear completely. In 1961, Detroit was beginning to abandon the enormous fins, almost absurd amounts of chrome, and those bodies that seemed inspired by jet aircraft. Buick was changing too, but it did not do so all at once, and the result was one of the most interesting convertibles of the entire decade. The 1961 LeSabre retained part of the visual spectacle of earlier Buicks, but compressed it into a considerably cleaner and more sophisticated body. The car was still enormous, low and wide, although its shapes now seemed to flow in a much more natural way. Just look at the front. The 4 headlights were positioned at the outer edges of a very low, wide chrome grille, creating an almost serious expression. But then came the front fenders, with lines that rose slightly above the hood and gave the car a much more sculptural appearance than usual. And at the rear, something even stranger happened. Buick did not completely eliminate the rear fins. It simply reinterpreted them. Instead of rising vertically like those on so many cars from the late 1950s, the rear forms seemed to extend outward, accompanied by taillights integrated into a body full of unconventional curves and angles. From certain angles, it still looked extravagant, from others, surprisingly elegant. But it is when the roof disappears that everything works even better. In the convertible, the enormous body is practically exposed from end to end. The beltline seems endless. The low windshield emphasizes the proportions, and the interior is completely open, surrounded by large amounts of painted metal, vinyl, and chrome details. It was exactly the kind of automobile that could transform something as simple as driving slowly down a boulevard into an event. And although the LeSabre was Buick's entry-level full-size model, it was not a particularly humble automobile either. As standard, it used a 364 cubic inch V8 producing 250 horsepower. Its price started at around $3,382, and Buick produced 11,971 LeSabre convertibles during 1961. It was not an exotic piece reserved for a privileged few. It was a relatively accessible version of that early 1960s American fantasy. An enormous convertible, plenty of chrome, a V8 up front, and practically nothing above your head. A 1963 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray. In 1963, Chevrolet did something far more daring than simply redesign the Corvette. It completely changed the way America imagined a sports car. Until then, the Corvette had evolved progressively from that small roadster of the 1950s. But the second generation appeared with a completely different presence. Lower, sharper, more aggressive, and above all, with a body that looked as if it had escaped from an auto show. Much of that transformation was born under the direction of Bill Mitchell, with Larry Shinoda playing a fundamental role in the design. The result took ideas from the experimental Stingray racer of the late 1950s and turned them into an automobile that any customer could find at a Chevrolet dealership. And all it takes is one look from the front to understand why it made such an impact. The hood seemed to stretch between two raised fenders, while the headlights disappeared completely behind retractable panels. There was no enormous chrome grille dominating the front end. Everything was designed to keep the surface low, clean, and almost razor sharp. But the real spectacle began when you walked around the car. The beltline dropped in the center and rose again over the rear wheels, creating a kind of continuous motion along the entire body. The wheel arches looked tense. The cabin sat far back, and the rear ended in a surprisingly abrupt way. And then came the detail that turned the 1963 Corvette into one of the most recognizable American cars of all time: the split rear window. A strip ran down the center of the glass and visually continued through the roof and body, dividing the rear into two almost symmetrical halves. It was spectacular. It was also impractical. Zora Arkus Duntov criticized the solution because it hurt rear visibility, while Bill Mitchell insisted on keeping it for aesthetic reasons. The disagreement became part of Corvette history, and Chevrolet removed the divider just 1 year later. That is why the famous split window belongs exclusively to the 1963 Coupe. But reducing this car to that window alone would be unfair. Chevrolet sold 21,513 Corvettes in 1963, compared with 14,531 the year before, and 10,594 of them were coupes. The new Stingray was not only beautiful, it turned the Corvette into a much more desirable product. And perhaps that is the best way to define it. Many cars age until they become classics. And now I want to hear from you. In your opinion, is the 1963 split window the most beautiful Corvette of all time? Or is there another year that beats it? Leave your answer in the comments. 1963 Buick Riviera. At the beginning of the 1960s, many American manufacturers seemed to be competing to see who could add more decoration to a body. Buick decided to do exactly the opposite. When the Riviera appeared for 1963, it seemed to belong to a completely different school of design. It was long and powerful, as expected from a large American automobile, but at the same time clean, low, and surprisingly restrained. It did not need gigantic fins or mountains of chrome to prove that it was special. And that was no accident. The project was born within General Motors under the direction of Bill Mitchell, while Ned Nichols played a fundamental role in shaping the final Riviera design. The intention was to create a personal luxury coupe with a more sophisticated, almost European presence, capable of competing directly with the Ford Thunderbird. The result had extraordinary proportions. The hood was long and almost horizontal. The roof seemed positioned far back, with relatively thin pillars and an almost vertical rear window. The sides were so clean that a simple chrome line along the lower body was enough to emphasize the car's length. But probably the most interesting thing was the way each end of the car had its own personality. At the front, the grille was integrated between fenders that projected slightly forward. The headlights were housed inside elegant enclosures at the outer edges, while the center remained clean and low. From the rear, the Riviera looked even wider. The taillights were hidden within a very simple horizontal composition, and the corners of the body ended almost like the edges of a sculpture. There was nothing especially extravagant, and that was exactly why it worked. Inside, Buick continued distancing it from a conventional automobile. There were 4 individual seats, a center console running through the cabin, and wraparound instrumentation that helped create the feeling of being inside a true grand tourer, not simply an enormous 2-door Buick. And although we are talking about beauty here, there was no shortage of personality beneath that body either. Initially, it used the 401 Nailhead V8 producing 325 horsepower, while during the year, the enormous 425 producing 340 horsepower appeared as an option. Buick also deliberately limited production of the first Riviera to 40,000 units, reinforcing the idea that the car should feel more exclusive than the rest of its lineup. But the true importance of the 1963 Riviera lies elsewhere. It proved that an American automobile could convey luxury without necessarily resorting to excess. While other cars tried to attract attention by adding elements, the Riviera managed to do it by removing them. And more than 60 years later, it is still difficult to find an unnecessary line anywhere on its body. The result was one of those rare designs that do not seem completely tied to their era. The Riviera simply looks elegant. 1967 Plymouth Barracuda Fastback. Some cars need years to find their identity. The Barracuda needed only 1 generation. When it originally appeared in 1964, Plymouth had tried to create something sporty using much of the Valiant's structure. The result had personality, especially thanks to that gigantic rear window, but it was still obvious that underneath was a fairly conventional compact automobile. In 1967, that changed completely. The second-generation Barracuda received a much lower, wider, and better proportioned body, and for the first time, it looked as if it had been designed from the beginning to be a genuine sporty coupe. And among its 3 body configurations, the Fastback was probably the one that best captured that transformation. The roof flowed gently down from the windshield until it almost met the rear, forming a continuous line that made the car look as if it were moving even when standing still. The enormous, almost vertical piece of glass from the previous model was gone. Now the rear window was perfectly integrated into a much more mature silhouette. But the most interesting detail was how Plymouth managed to preserve the Barracuda's personality without simply repeating the original formula. The rear still looked visually substantial, but now it was divided by cleaner lines and better proportioned surfaces. The rear pillars were thick, the belt line rose slightly toward the back, and the rear fenders seemed to wrap around the wheels in a way that anticipated some of the muscular styling that would dominate Detroit only a few years later. The front was equally simple. 2 round headlights at the outer edges, a relatively narrow horizontal grille, and a long hood gave the car a serious expression without the need for exaggerated decoration. And viewed from the side, perhaps its best characteristic became clear: the balance between compact size and grand touring proportions. It also helped that Plymouth offered a fairly broad range of engines. It could be bought with a modest 6-cylinder, but also with V8 such as the 273, and during 1967, even the new 383 producing 280 horsepower appeared. That engine required a few compromises, especially because of the limited space under the hood, but it made it clear that the Barracuda was rapidly moving toward muscle car territory. And perhaps that is why it looks so well resolved today. Clean enough to be elegant, muscular enough to be exciting, and different enough that no one could mistake it for another car. 1968 Dodge Charger RT. Some cars are beautiful because of their proportions, and others seem to have been designed specifically to intimidate. The Charger clearly belongs to the second group. When Dodge introduced the second generation of the Charger, it abandoned much of the more experimental look of the original model and created a body that was much more muscular, cleaner, and far more memorable. The result became one of the most recognizable silhouettes of the entire muscle car era. And much of that identity came from a very simple idea: make the car look wide, low, and tense. From the front, the headlights were practically invisible. They were hidden behind a black grille that stretched across almost the entire width of the car, creating a dark and aggressive expression even when it was parked. The chrome bumper sat lower, discreetly, allowing the grille to completely dominate the front view. But the profile was even more important. The front and rear fenders seemed to bulge around a narrower waist, creating that famous Coke bottle silhouette that defined so many American cars of the late 1960s. On the Charger, however, that shape was taken almost to the extreme. The fastback roof flowed gently toward the rear, while the large side sections gave the car a permanent sense of motion. It did not simply look long, it looked ready to launch forward, and the R/T version, short for road/track, reinforced that personality even further. As standard, it came with the 440 Magnum V8, producing 375 horsepower, and for those who wanted something even more extreme, the legendary 426 Hemi, producing 425 horsepower, was available. But even without talking about power, the RT already looked different thanks to its badges, specific details, and that visual presence that made it difficult to confuse with a conventional Charger. What is interesting is that the 1968 design did not need enormous spoilers, exaggerated air scoops, or flashy graphics to communicate aggression. The body itself did all the work. That helps explain why this Charger survived far beyond its own era. Decades later, it appeared again and again in movies, television, video games, and popular culture, until it practically became a visual representation of the American muscle car. Now, I want to know, if you had to choose purely by design, would you take this 1968 Charger RT or the 1967 Barracuda Fastback? Leave your answer in the comments. 1961 Lincoln Continental. By the end of the 1950s, American luxury seemed trapped in a race to make cars increasingly larger, more heavily chromed, and more extravagant. Lincoln decided to break away from all of that. The 1961 Continental appeared with an almost opposite philosophy: straight lines, clean surfaces, carefully controlled proportions, and a body that communicated luxury without needing to shout about it. And that change was far more radical than it may seem today. The previous model was enormous, visually heavy, and loaded with details. For 1961, designer Elwood Engel and Ford's team transformed the Continental into something much more restrained. The car was still large, but it no longer looked gigantic. In fact, it was approximately 1 foot shorter than its predecessor, something almost revolutionary for an American luxury automobile at the time. The magic was in the proportions. The roof looked like a glass box perfectly placed on top of the body, with thin pillars and enormous glass areas that made the car appear even cleaner. There was not a single unnecessary curve, no large fins. And then there were the doors. The Continental brought back the famous rear hinge rear doors. They were not simply a theatrical styling feature. They made access to the rear seats easier and, when all 4 doors were open, created an image completely unlike any other American sedan of the time. That detail would become one of the car's most remembered features. Under the hood was a 430 cubic inch V8. Because it was still a Lincoln, and no one exactly expected mechanical modesty. But that engine was not the center of its personality. It was designed to move with calmness, isolation, and authority. And visually, it communicated exactly that. It did not look fast. It did not try to look sporty. Its beauty came from the discipline of the design. In a decade that would eventually produce some of the most aggressive muscle cars in history, Lincoln proved that an American automobile could also be memorable simply by being clean, well-proportioned, and monumental. 1965, Pontiac Catalina 2+2. In 1965, Pontiac was going through one of the most interesting periods in its history. The brand had left much of its old conservative image behind, and was building a personality that was much younger, sportier, and more aggressive. The GTO received much of the attention, but within the full-size lineup, there was another car that proved an enormous automobile could also have an extraordinarily attractive presence: the Catalina 2+2. At first glance, it was still a large 1960s Pontiac, long, wide, and with a body that occupied a tremendous amount of space. But the visual treatment made it look considerably more athletic than a traditional full-size sedan or coupe. Much of the credit was in the profile. The hardtop roof flowed cleanly toward a long, low rear section, while the beltline ran almost the entire length of the body without unnecessary interruptions. The sides carried a slight tension over the wheel arches, and the body seemed to hug the ground in a way that disguised its enormous dimensions surprisingly well. And then there was the front. Pontiac had already turned the split grille into one of its most recognizable features, and in 1965, that identity was especially well resolved. The center section formed a kind of pronounced point, with the two grilles separated on each side, and the vertical headlights positioned at the outer edges. That made the car look narrower and more aggressive from the front, even though it was actually enormous. The rear followed the same philosophy. Instead of relying on overly decorative shapes, Pontiac used relatively horizontal lines and a wide composition that reinforced the sense of stability. The 2+2 package added exactly the dose of sportiness that this body needed. Originally introduced shortly before, the name referred to a 4-seat configuration with a sportier image. By 1965, the 2+2 had already become its own model within the Catalina range and could be equipped with large V8s, including the 421, making it clear that this enormous coupe did not exist only to look good in front of a restaurant. But what is interesting here is how Pontiac managed to communicate all that power without destroying the elegance of the design. It could look sophisticated parked in front of a hotel, and a few minutes later make it clear that beneath that enormous body, there was something much more serious. 1967 Shelby GT500. The original Mustang was already an attractive car, but in 1967, Carroll Shelby took that familiar silhouette and managed to make it look longer, lower, and considerably more dangerous without destroying the proportions that had made it famous. That year, Ford carried out the first major redesign of the Mustang. The body grew, became wider, and gained an engine bay designed to accommodate large V8. Shelby took advantage of that new foundation to push his interpretation of the Mustang much further than before, and visually, almost no angle was left untouched. At the front appeared an elongated fiberglass nose accompanied by a new hood with a huge air scoop. The conventional grille almost disappeared, and, on the early cars, two large auxiliary lights sat together in the center, creating an expression that looked more like a European rally car than a Mustang from Detroit. Some of them would later be moved toward the outer edges to comply with the laws of certain states. But what was extraordinary about the GT500 was that the modifications did not look like pieces added afterward. They worked with the body. Behind the doors appeared air scoops on the side panels and additional ones higher up beside the rear windows. The Mustang's original fastback was still there, but it was now surrounded by so many subtle changes that the silhouette looked more exotic and much more exclusive. It looked aggressive, but not exaggerated. Even the famous stripes could make the car look even more dramatic, although the GT500 did not depend on them to attract attention. Its long hood, rearward set cabin, and that fastback roofline already provided almost all the spectacle it needed. And then there was what justified that appearance. Under the hood was a 428 V8, officially rated at 355 horsepower, turning the GT500 into the Shelby Mustang, designed less as a pure competition machine and more as a brutal American grand tourer. It was heavier and more comfortable than the early GT35Os, could be equipped with air conditioning and an automatic transmission, but retained enough Shelby DNA that no one could mistake it for a normal Mustang. Only 2,048 GT500s were built for 1967, and that year was special for another reason. It would be the last in which production Shelby Mustangs came out of Shelby's original operation in California before manufacturing moved to Michigan. And now I want to know which one you would choose purely based on appearance: the 1967 Shelby GT500 or the 1968 Dodge Charger RT we saw earlier. Two completely different ways of interpreting the muscle car, but only one can remain. Leave your answer in the comments. 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. To close this list, few cars represent the boldness of 1960s American design better. When the Oldsmobile Toronado appeared in 1966, it looked more like a concept car than a large production coupe. Under the direction of Bill Mitchell, with David North playing a key role in its design, Oldsmobile created a body completely unlike anything else in the brand's lineup. The front end was low and clean, with the headlights hidden behind panels integrated into the grille, while the enormous hood and pronounced wheel arches gave the car an almost sculptural presence. From the side, it was even more impressive. The extremely long hood, rearward set cabin, and sloping roof created grand touring proportions, while the almost completely unadorned sides allowed the shape of the body itself to become the main attraction. But the Toronado was not revolutionary only on the outside. Under the hood was an enormous 425 Rocket V8 producing 385 horsepower, but all the power was sent to the front wheels. It was the first mass-produced American automobile with front-wheel drive since the Cords of the 1930s, a completely unexpected solution for an American coupe of this size. And that was precisely what made the Toronado so special. It was enormous, powerful, and luxurious, but at the same time, it seemed ahead of its era. The gamble worked. It was named Motor Trend Car of the Year for 1966, and more than 40,000 units found buyers during its first year. Yet, 6 decades later, what truly remains is its design, because you can remove the badges, forget its revolutionary mechanical layout, and simply look at the silhouette. The 1966 Toronado still looks different from anything else Detroit was building at the time, and that is a great way to close this list. With a car that did not try to follow the trends of the 1960s, it tried to create one of its own. And so, we come to the end of this journey through some of the most beautiful American automobiles of the 1960s, a decade capable of producing cars as different as the elegant Riviera, the monumental Continental, or the aggressive Charger, but all with one thing in common, a visual identity that remains impossible to ignore more than half a century later. Now, I want to know which one was your favorite from the entire list, and which car do you think was missing? Leave your answer in the comments, because there are surely some models that deserve to appear in a second part. And if you enjoyed this journey, I also recommend watching our video about the most beautiful American automobiles of the 1950s, where we return to an even more extravagant era, filled with chrome, enormous fins, and some of the most elegant designs Detroit ever created. See you in the next video.